Today on Fear and Greed, global markets react nervously to the US-Europe showdown and prospect of tariffs, with riskier assets, including the Aussie dollar, sold off. Locally, house prices rise in February, suggesting that the cut in interest rates has reversed the falling market, and speculation on an election announcement grows. Plus, Endeavour's poor result and whisky wars erupt in the UK. Welcome to Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. It is Monday, the 3rd of March, 2025. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael.
Sean, the main story this morning, global markets are on edge following the showdown between US President Donald Trump and Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky over the weekend, which is all anyone's been talking about now for the last couple of days. And then we've got the introduction of new tariffs on Canada, Mexico and China this week. Gosh, you don't even know where to start, right?
No, I don't think investors know which way to turn at the moment. Starting on Wall Street, the clash between Trump and Zelensky triggered a sell-off on the S&P 500, but remarkably, it bounced later to finish higher. Now, some calmer inflation figures fed that rally. European stocks have fallen, with car makers among the biggest losers on the back of Trump's threat to hit the region with a 25% tariff. Everyone's waiting on the details of when and how those tariffs will be imposed. Canada and Mexico are expected to be hit with tariffs from tomorrow. 25% tariffs, assuming Mr. Trump doesn't change his mind, and China's expected to be hit with an extra 10% tariff. Riskier assets, as you said, in the lead, are wobbling. Bitcoin's down to 84,000 US dollars a unit. The Aussie dollar's trading about 62 US cents. Oil's down to 73 US dollars a barrel. Now, the local market had a bad day on Friday. It fell 4% for the month of February, wiping out pretty much all of this year's gains. Profit season's over. So we open today with futures markets saying the S&P ASX 200 will rise, and that's on the back of what happened on Wall Street over the weekend. However, all this uncertainty around geopolitics, around tariffs, is really hurting investors at the moment.
Sean, global leaders, I mean, there is a lot in this, right? Global leaders have certainly made it clear that Volodymyr Zelensky has their support. Most notably, you'd say UK Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer embraced Mr. Zelensky yesterday when the latter was visiting Downing Street, a very public display of support.
Yeah, it sure was. Plenty across Europe and elsewhere, including Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, have been very supportive of Mr. Zelensky, though notably not too many have said much about Donald Trump and JD Vance's behaviour. It's been more about Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky. Sir Keir said Ukraine had the full backing of the UK. Sir Keir hosted 14 European leaders overnight to rally military and financial support for Ukraine. But European leaders also want Zelensky to try and patch things up with Donald Trump. Now, senior Russian politicians were pretty happy with what they saw as Volodymyr Zelensky's White House humiliation. That's their words. They said the Ukrainian leader got what he deserved and that the US military aid to Kyiv must now be cut. Locally, Treasurer Jim Chalmers called Zelensky a hero. He was speaking on Sky and was asked about tariffs hitting Australia. He said that he'd had positive discussions with US Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, but the job will be difficult. You just get the feeling at the moment that, March 2025 is a moment in time where there's a shift, huge geopolitical shift, away from the US towards Europe, towards kind of a regrouping of allies. You sort of get that sense.
Yeah, it is hugely significant what's happened over the weekend. And I think it's interesting actually watching as well how it plays out within the US as well, and who speaks out and who doesn't speak out against it. And even just domestically, you saw in the US, that is, you saw JD Vance then head off on a skiing vacation. I don't know whether you saw this. He went to Vermont to go skiing then not long after this. Now, Vermont is quite a... not a lot of Republican voters.
No, I think it's three
in Vermont. And so the people were lining the streets. They had signs, placards that said,
I didn't see this.
It said, Vance is a traitor, go ski in Russia.
What's a bit scary, I think, for Ukraine, guys like Lindsey Graham, who's actually a Republican, senior Republican, been a big fan of Ukraine, he has sided with Trump. So it's incredible theatre. It's incredible that what has happened. But I just hope Ukraine make it through this because they need US support. That's the bottom line.
You're absolutely right. All right, Sean, back home now. And house prices rose last month, ending a somewhat short, shallow decline that lasted just 3 months. And Melbourne and Hobart, which are two of the worst performers last year, are actually leading the revival.
The month of January, I'll say that again, Michael, the month of February was good across the board. Every capital city and rest of state region rose, except Darwin, which dropped slightly, and regional Victoria, which was flat. Melbourne and Hobart were both up 0.4%. That's the first positive result for Melbourne in 10 months. The boom cities last year of Perth, Brisbane and Adelaide rose 0.2%, 0.3%. On a quarterly basis, though, Adelaide and Brisbane are leading the way. Perth has really come to a shuddering halt, though. Sydney's up about 0.3%. Melbourne and Sydney very much driven by the top end of the market. It tends to be more interest rate sensitive. And so with all the talk, we actually had the interest rate cut, but the talk ahead of that about interest rate cuts, that's helped that top end of the market in Sydney and Melbourne. Now, CoreLogic's Tim Lawless says expectations of lower interest rates are very much supporting the market.
And auction clearance rates, though, Sean, were a touch disappointing over the weekend.
They were, but that's because we've been used to 72% plus preliminary clearance rates the previous couple of weeks. Came in at 69.9%, 2,800 homes, a lot more homes on the market. Sydney was about 71, Melbourne about 70. Too early to tell, really, but the signs remain positive as we head into a busier period for the housing market.
Sean, after the show today, we've got a great interview coming up with Josh Gilbert from eToro, who's joined us in the studio, and it's a great conversation.
Sure, it's about the Magnificent Seven tech stocks. And Tesla in particular has been sold off hard recently. We ask him, is this the end of the Magnificent Seven's run? Now, Josh is across lots of things, but particularly the tech stocks. He has a very interesting take on it. I was going to say what he said, but I think you should listen to the interview because he just looks at it with a little more depth than I would in terms of why these stocks will do well or poorly.
I love all our interviews, but this is a particular favourite. It is a must-listen for investors, so stick around for that one. It's coming up after the show. We've got a bit more still to get through, Sean. We're talking election day speculation, Star Entertainment's very shaky future, and whisky wars. So much still to come. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, there is plenty of speculation this morning about an election date. And yesterday, Treasurer Jim Chalmers moved to hose down the chat, saying he was working to produce a budget in the usual way.
Yeah, that didn't hose down anything though, really.
No.
Speculation's everywhere. Now, the budget is scheduled for late March. If an election is called, the government would produce what they call an economic update rather than a full budget. Dr. Chalmers said the Prime Minister will call the poll in due course. Now, the poll has to be held before May 17. Chalmers wants it to be fought on the economy. Speculation remains that the poll will be called after the Western Australian state election next weekend. The campaign must run for at least 33 days. So if the Prime Minister wants to go to the polls on April 12, which has been rumoured for some time, don't be surprised if next Sunday the Prime Minister calls an election. If he wants to go on May 17, which is the other favoured date, well, obviously he's got time to wait. Over the weekend, opposition leader Peter Dutton committed $3 billion towards buying 28 new fighter jets for the Air Force if elected. We're going to get lots of those sorts of announcements in coming weeks.
I mentioned Star Entertainment before. The group has told lenders, Sean, that it is 1 week away from running out of cash, and it has sought regulatory clearance for an administrator to take control of the group should it fail to secure a fresh injection of funds.
The operator of casinos in Sydney, the Gold Coast and Brisbane was on the brink of collapse on Friday evening when markets closed. It is trying to lock in a short-term funding deal, essentially, according to the Fin Review. Chief Executive Steve McCann and his bankers had spent the last few days scrambling to secure a lifeline after deferring the publication of accounts, half-year accounts, which couldn't be signed off by the board without a funding deal and finalised accounts. The company can't trade today.
A strong demand for a new generation of artificial intelligence-enabled devices is driving sales growth at Harvey Norman. I don't know about you, Sean, but as soon as I think artificial intelligence-enabled devices at Harvey Norman, I'm thinking really smart washing machines.
Well, What's interesting, Harvey Norman and JB Hi-Fi at the beginning of the reporting season, Harvey Norman at the end of it, they both said the same thing. People want AI-enabled products, and that's actually helping sales. So the white goods and electronic retailer announced better than expected first half results, and Chair Jerry Harvey expects ongoing sales strength in home appliances, televisions, audio devices, mobile phones, and computers. Sales in Australia were higher, particularly in the pre-Christmas season, which is very important to the bottom line. However, sales in New Zealand, the UK, Singapore, and Malaysia were less positive. Harvey Norman's share price rose by more than 4% on Friday.
Endeavour Group's profit fell by more than expected across its pubs and liquor stores as the hospitality giant confirmed it would appoint Ari Mervis, executive chairman, as a search for a permanent chief executive drags on.
It does. Do you know the main problem for Endeavour Group at the moment?
What is it?
People aren't drinking as much as they used to.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Like the bottom line with Endeavour is just,
Here I was thinking it was going to be something bigger, something to do with like the accounts or something like that. But no, it's actually something about just human consumer behaviour.
Yeah, so Endeavour runs hundreds of pubs, Dan Murphy's, BWS. Net profit for the first half of the financial year was down about 15%, way worse than expectations, triggered a 7% sell-off in the stock. Endeavour was spun out of Woolies in 2021. It's really struggled for several years with sluggish demand for alcohol. So this trend of not buying as much alcohol has been going on for a while. On Friday, it said revenues were nearly flat, with sales at Dan Murphy's and BWS outlets sliding 1.5%. But just the bottom line for Endeavour, people just aren't buying as much alcohol as they used to.
Can I ask you a question that you may not know the answer to?
Yes. Go on.
Why? Why was it spun out? Because was it because that way Woolies kind of doesn't have alcohol within it, and so it appeals to a different kind of group of investors and larger, perhaps institutional investors, that kind of thing, or is there more to it than that?
I think that's all part of it. But at the end of the day, a board will spin out an operation like Endeavour out of Woolies if they think they can get more shareholder value from it. And that might not just be shareholder value on Endeavour. It may actually be shareholder value for Woolworths because Endeavour isn't pulling it back. So I think the answer is that the board decided the two separate operations were worth more than one combined.
Yep.
There has forever, ever since Roger Corbett, who used to be the boss of Woolies, got into liquor retailing, kind of calls for Woolies to get out of liquor retailing, pokies, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
But I actually think at the end of the day, it was a shareholder value thing.
Okay, all right. Turning to international news now, and the Israeli government says it has blocked the entry of all humanitarian aid into Gaza because the first phase of the ceasefire with Hamas has expired.
That expired about 24 hours ago. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's office said Hamas had so far refused to accept a temporary ceasefire extension. A Hamas spokesperson called the move cheap blackmail and a coup on the ceasefire agreement and urged mediators to get Israel to resume the supply of aid, according to the BBC. The Palestinian group wants phase 2 of the deal to go ahead as originally negotiated, with the release of hostages and Palestinian prisoners and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza. Now, on Friday night, Hamas said it would not agree to any extension of phase 1 without guarantees from the US, Qatar and Egyptian mediators that phase 2 would eventually take place. Yesterday, Mr. Netanyahu's office said Israel had agreed to a US proposal for the ceasefire to continue for about 6 weeks during the Muslim Ramadan and Jewish Passover periods, but the state of that ceasefire is very much up in the air at the moment.
Finally, Sean, I suspect we're in for a bit of a lesson here, so please educate us. Whisky wars have broken out in Britain, and it is all because Scottish politicians are upset over English plans to label some of its liquor as single malt.
In fact, Scottish politicians are calling it sabotage, and they fear it will undermine the $5.4 billion US Scotch whisky sector. It's all about the term single malt. Now, I'm not a Scotch drinker, so I don't know. I had to do the research here because I didn't really understand it. Scottish rules requires the malt grains to be mashed, fermented, and distilled all at the same site in order for the drink to be a single malt. The English definition only requires the whisky to be distilled at the site to become a single malt grade, according to the FT. Now, the British Parliament plans to allow the English-style single malt. That's caused the upset. The English Whisky Guild said its application was consistent with the US, which produces whisky and aligned with the single malt Welsh whisky geographical indication. Now, I can't imagine the Scots being real happy about saying, yeah, just because the US and the Welsh do it, therefore it's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a very hard time for the Scottish whisky industry. Turbulent global conditions it really has never fully recovered from the COVID-19 pandemic. Higher input costs, lower demand leading to overstocked warehouses. Single malt exports were down 17% last year, even though export volumes were up, reflecting the changing trends in global consumer preferences. In their words, many drinkers basically are shifting to cheaper whisky. It's a crisis, Michael.
It is a crisis. But you know what? The thing I love most, people listening to this today will take a lot of things out of the show. But I reckon the one thing that's really going to stick around is the definition of single malt whiskey, because it's one of those terms you hear it all the time.
Yeah, and you're never quite sure what it means.
Yep. And now you can bust that one out at a dinner party and sound very, very educated. Oh, is this single malt? Is it real single malt or UK single malt?
Distilled or not? Yeah.
Oh, no, I like it mashed on the site as well. Now, Sean, up next is Fear and Greed the Week Ahead, featuring resident economist Stephen Koukoulas. He's very excited, as always.
As always, big week. We've got economic growth figures for the December quarter coming out. Very important to see where we stand as an economy. I think he's suggesting kind of 1.4%, I think he said, annual growth. Great chat with Stephen.
Yeah, big week. And following that is the Fear and Greed Daily interview with Josh Gilbert from eToro, all about the Magnificent Seven. They are coming up in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Thank you, Michael.
It is Monday, the 3rd of March, 2025. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X, TikTok and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed. Have a great day.